Okay, so good afternoon. Good afternoon to those of you that are here with us today, and thank you for coming. There's a bit of noise in the background, so please apologize. Thank you very much for being with us here today, and let me first thank the Ministry of Ecological Transition of Spain, the organizers of the Spanish Pavilion, and Iberdrola for making this possible today. Thank you very much. This is the launch of our Leadership for Net Zero initiative, and when I say our, it's because I'm speaking on behalf of the Club de Madrid. The Club de Madrid is an organization that brings together democratic presidents and prime ministers from 122 countries, from 122 members, from 72 countries, sorry about that. And they come from a very, very broad political spectrum, and the objective, the mission of the organization is to bring their voice and agency to fostering democratic values and democratic leadership across the world, and to address those issues that make for a more effective, inclusive, and sustainable democracy. So this means that our members are particularly well positioned to speak about leadership issues, but in speaking and as the basis of our work, they speak with others and try to engage in dialogue with others on those issues that are important in fostering democratic values. And in that sense, climate action has been an issue of special attention for Club de Madrid for many years, conscious of the threat that global warming and climate change is posing to our societies and to humanity at large. So on this occasion and through this new initiative that we're launching, we are bringing together political, business, and civil society leaders to precisely stress and emphasize the need for collaboration amongst these three groups, amongst these three cohorts of our society. Now, access, convening power, and political leadership is what the Club of Madrid members bring to this discussion. But we have also invited today to be with us representatives from these sectors from different countries. We have with us Ambassador Hyun Kim, who is the Deputy Minister for Climate Change of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Korea, and also Korea's Chief Climate Negotiator. Next to her, we have Ilona Sabo de Carvalho, who is an environmental activist, but also a youth activist, and who has, for many, many years, been engaged in this, let's call it battle and struggle to put climate change at the top of the political agenda and of civil society's agenda. She's a very well-known civil society activist. Also, we have with us Camila Labarca, who is the head of the Mitigation and Transparency of Climate Change Division at the Environment Ministry of Chile. And last but not least, Gonzalo Sainz de Miera, who is the Director of Climate Change and Alliances of Iberdrola and the President of the Spanish Green Growth Group. Now, as I was saying, we would like to bring all of these panelists together in this dialogue, in this exchange, and as much as possible with those that are with us here today in person, and hopefully engage those that are online and streaming as well. Now, the first thing that I'd like to ask, and I'll invite all of you to think about this and have it in the back of your minds, is that it is obvious that in democratic systems, the realm of possibilities for policy action to reach net zero is conditioned by citizens' political support, by citizens' engagement. And that is what we have to have in the back of our minds when we have our discussion this morning. But we know that citizens are divided on this issue, perhaps not those that have been with us these days in COP27, because we are, to a certain extent, preaching to the converted. But this is something that we're all very much aware of, and this is what is at the core of this Leadership for Net Zero initiative. How do we bring up citizens' engagement? How do we build that up, and how do we contribute from these different sectors, the political, the business, and the civil society, to get this necessary buy-in in this process, so that those that are deniers we can maybe bring some of those into the fold, and those that are, well, doubting can also be brought into the fold, because achieving that net zero emissions objective is an opportunity. It'll be an opportunity for many, an opportunity obviously for all of us who will have better lifestyles and better health, among other things, but also an opportunity for business. And so it is these three cohorts that will have to be working to achieve these goals. Now, how can governments, private sector, businesses, and civil society work together to accelerate and to scale the clean energy transition, and at the same time ensure that public support and buy-in that we were talking about? Let me ask Prime Minister Campbell first, if we are at present in this goal, in this effort to gain this net zero commitment that so many countries have already made, what do you think are the incentives that political leaders need in order to move away from what is natural in a political system that is more framed by short-term political terms in office, by elections, and by a system that is in itself conditioned by short-termism? How can we move this to long-term horizons?
Well, I think it's a big challenge, and it's a big challenge for us today. There's a lot going on here, which is, I congratulate you for your efforts in trying to focus on our conversation. I think this question of long-term versus short-term thinking is not confined to politics. We also see it in business, with companies needing to show profits on the quarterly balance sheet. And I think to a large extent, this is a big challenge. But we've seen in the United States just recently, after several years of non-action and kind of depressing non-action on the part of the government, that some important legislation has passed that does provide a more long-term commitment to funding some of the building blocks of a good climate policy. I think when we talk about leadership, the Club of Madrid, as you've heard, is the largest forum of former democratic presidents and prime ministers, 120 members from 72 countries. And so we all have a deep commitment to the democratic process, but we don't have any power. And sometimes there is a power in powerlessness. So sometimes leaders can be effective even when they don't have their hands on the levers of power, because they understand how the system works. They have, some track record in some way of being public people. And so I think what is very important is for those who have the capacity to exercise leadership to seek the opportunities to create the constituency for good policy. And that means trying to enlighten members of the public on the importance of the decisions that have to be made, and perhaps even short-term sacrifices that might be made. But it's also true that there have been, on the issue of climate over the last few decades, concerted efforts by certain industries to obfuscate the science of climate change and to try to persuade people that the science is uncertain. And that's the worst thing for a politician, because people might support long-term policies if they're convinced that you are certain about the basis on which you're making them. But if you're persuaded that maybe climate change isn't that big a problem, or we might not need to do these major things, then it's very difficult to be part of a constituency for good policy making. So I think all of the areas of leadership we're talking about today, political, business, civil society, and of course the very important role that our diplomatic corps play in communicating with other countries, and our foreign policies communicating with other countries, all play a role. Because if we allow people to misrepresent the science of climate change, whether it's from a business perspective or an NGO perspective. All of that erodes the ability of politicians to make the decisions they need to take. Several years ago, the leader of a major Canadian oil company gave a very interesting speech in which he acknowledged that climate change was real. And then he went on to criticize what he described, these are his words, climate deniers and the politicians who pander to them. And it made me very angry because in my view it wasn't politicians pandering to them. It was climate deniers trying to persuade politicians that it was in their interest to resist making important decisions, what we call the delayers, people who want to delay decisions. So there is no one segment of society that can wave the magic wand. We all have to cooperate to use whatever capacity we have to persuade, and different segments of society have different audiences, different groups of people who find them credible. And we all have to come together on a shared message of what the science is, what is necessary, and the reality. And as I say, I think many politicians have in fact shown courage to pass good legislation and to initiate good policy, but they can't do it in a vacuum. And what I would just conclude by saying that sometimes leadership is found in people who don't necessarily have levers of power in their hands. And in the Club of Madrid, what we find is that sometimes powerlessness is powerful because we can go and speak to people without any vested interest. We're not speaking for a government, but we're speaking based on our own experience and our knowledge, and can often translate that into a receptive relationship with an audience that is interested in what we have to say. So sometimes even when you don't feel that you have a position that calls you, quote, a leader, you may in fact be a leader because you have built a relationship that gives you an opportunity to speak to people persuasively about these important issues. So all leadership is necessary. You can never have too much of it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Thank you very much, Prime Minister Campbell. Is that working? So, Ambassador Kim, can you hear me?
No, well, not really.
No, it's a...
You have to put it closer.
There? Okay, sorry. Thank you. Ambassador Kim, Prime Minister Campbell just referred to the diplomats and how diplomacy also plays a role in this. But you wear two hats. You do this at home in Korea and you do it internationally. So can you tell us a bit about what you see happening in Korea in terms of this dialogue between the different sectors, and also how this relates to what's going on at the multilateral level? And finally, if you can, tell us a little bit about what you see as the main results coming out of this COP27. Thank you very much.
Thank you. First of all, let me express my thanks to Club de Madrid for organizing this important session. Actually, leadership issue is very critical. As Prime Minister Campbell already mentioned, we need leadership in every sector of the society. So if I just say about what is necessary for strong climate action domestically and globally, I always emphasize so-called whole of the society approach. So at national level, we need the whole of the society approach. And at global level as well, we need the whole of the society approach. So in Korea, Korean government announced carbon neutrality by 2050 and very strong nationally determined contribution, which is reducing greenhouse gas emission 40% by 2030 last year. And after the announcement of carbon neutrality target and the strong NDC by 2030, Korean government rebuilt Presidential Commission on Carbon Neutrality and Green Growth. And this Presidential Commission is composed of all relevant ministers from the government and also experts from each important sector of the society. Therefore, that commission is indeed a partnership of government and society, non-government sector. And they discussed together in making any major decisions about policies and actions to achieve carbon neutrality and NDC. And particularly what I want to highlight is in this Presidential Commission on Carbon Neutrality and Green Growth, we have representatives from the youth. So young people, they have official place to deliver their voice. In the UNFCCC negotiations as well, we parties always say that we need voice from the youth because they are the ones who will live with the consequences of climate change. Therefore, it means they are major stakeholders and their voice must be delivered to the climate change negotiation as a main voice. So domestically, Korea is making a lot of efforts to invite everybody on board and nobody left behind. In a society, there are, whatever it is developed or developing countries, there are certain groups who are negatively very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And also there are people who are vulnerable to the so-called green transition. So people who are working in so-called fossil fuel areas or traditional, for example, combustion engine cars part, manufacturing sector. Therefore, domestically, it is very important how to make so-called a just transition, because carbon neutrality is a transformation, is a paradigm shift, and it gives huge impact to a lot of people's daily life. Therefore, the government must be very careful in designing well-targeted policies and actions, inviting the people who are particularly vulnerable to the transition. That's why in Korea, we also established the Climate Change Response Fund, which is targeting vulnerable people for their just transition. So we are helping them we are providing training and re-education programs for them, and also we are helping them to move from their current job to new green jobs. So therefore, I would like to say that climate action is not climate action is not an agenda of Ministry of Environment or Ministry of Climate Change. I believe this is across the government agenda. So all ministries, such as Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Industry, Ministry of Environment, even Ministry of Transportation and Agriculture, Maritime Affairs, all of them, they must work together. That's why Korea's Presidential Commission on Green Growth and Carbon Neutrality, they invite all relevant ministers working together. Maybe I can stop here. Yes, then you may move to the next questions.
Thank you
yes.
very much. You've raised some very interesting points. Sorry, you've raised some very important points, and some that we will be touching with some of the other panelists as well. But Ilona, if I may, as a civil society activist and somebody that has for a long time, both nationally and internationally, been working on issues that are very much a part of the climate action agenda. And given the fact that you're Brazilian and Brazil is back, as we heard yesterday, can you tell us a bit about how you see from the civil society perspective this collaboration and this, well, co-leadership really on climate action, and what you see changing in these past couple of years, but also and most especially what you see changing moving forward?
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you, Maria Elena and Club de Madrid, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will just start by saying we need leadership for net zero, for nature positive, for social inclusivity. So I think we're in line here that the ambition has to be set very high. I agree with all the points that were mentioned here, and I would say for me as a civil society leader from an organization that is a think tank that develops evidence to shape then solutions and partnerships to reach the goals that are common goals. I think there are a few things that worry me most today. I think the first one, as already mentioned here, disinformation. We're not agreeing on the basic set of facts towards which we need to then deal with the challenge ahead of us. So I think there's a big problem today in terms of how to mobilize citizen support, how to do the work that we need to do in the multi-stakeholder levels, that if we don't agree with the same facts. So I think this is an issue of concern that we should address. A second issue, it's like when we sit down at the table in a setting like this, and I absolutely think that there's no way out without a networked multilateralism, without a multi-stakeholder approach. We need to make sure we're coming with the public interest at the center. So I do understand that governments, private sector, civil society, we all come from different places, but when the issue is the one that is like the biggest emergency we have in our hands today, we need to make sure who is sitting at the table has the public interest in mind, and also acknowledging that there will be trade-offs, there will be negotiations, but we can't, let's say, not agree on the minimum standards to follow. And when I think about the size of the, let's say, the challenges that we have, I only think that, you know, as Prime Minister Campbell mentioned, there will be countries that can do comprehensive plans like the IRA or the European Green New Deal, but there are most countries that cannot reach a just transition without, let's say, the right incentives in place. So Maria Elena knows I'm also a member of the UN Secretary General Board on Effective Multilateralism, where I'm co-leading the climate governance group. And there we're just being very honest in saying we're going to need not only the access to knowledge and new technologies, but to finance and to make sure we have the accountability mechanisms to then monitor all the commitments, but all the support we're giving to big countries or the commitments that companies also are making if we want to leapfrog. And there's no other chance. We have to leapfrog. But the way I see today, and I think at this COP is very clear as well, there will be issues that are hard, there are commitments that are hard, but without putting the developing world into the picture to really take the same train in the green transition, we will all fail. And so I feel there's not enough leadership to that. As a Brazilian, I'm happy also my country's coming back to the multilateral table with a very high ambition. I still think in some issues we have to have an even higher, especially in the energy transition. Have to see also Brazil as a potential not only, you know, nature green power, but also green energy power and also sustainable food production power. And I do believe Brazil will be able to play this role not only for us in Latin America, but also for, you know, our fellow countries in Africa and Asia to just align, let's say, the minimum interests and standards that will have to be set really with the international finance institutions, with, you know, blended finance mechanisms to make sure the transition is for all, especially for those that are already left behind. So I would just like to put at this, I think we have to make sure what we're saying here fits the world in a let's say a much more equitable position than we have today for countries that have so much work to do and need full support to come to the tables with a level of financial commitment that they can also meet their goals.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ilona. Thank you, Ilona. And let me go to Camila. You're from Chile, so you're on the other side of Latin America and looking towards the Pacific. So I'm interested in listening to how Chile is working, and the new government in Chile is working on, obviously, climate action and on achieving net zero, and how you are reaching out to others in the region, especially when it is a continent, Latin America, that faces both the Atlantic and the Pacific. You face the Pacific, but this idea that in terms of partnerships at the multilateral level, you're also able to look more closely both to political leadership and business leadership from Europe, but also from Asia. So bringing this combination and how you're seeing this.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you also very much for the invitation. Also regarding what you told at the beginning about having this different size in policy, that sometimes they can change and then climate change action stops. Well, in our country, we have a kind of different scenario because there is this common consensus within the population that climate change is one of the most important challenges we have to deal with, and it's urgent. So we have, in the last years, have different sides in the politics, in the government, but there's an agreement and they all have actions in climate change. That's why we were able also to have this year a climate change law, which objective is to have carbon neutrality by the latest at 2050. So that is a law for now. So it doesn't depend on the government that is at the time. And I think this happens because we are a very vulnerable country. So people, they know we have to do things to adapt to the climate change. And also mitigation actions have so many co-benefits, and it will help to our sustainable development. It's not something that we have to choose between development and mitigation. It's something that comes together. And for example, we can improve our waste management or clean our air and have new industries and new green jobs as well. So I think that is why there's a common consensus in the population. And I think in Latin America it's similar. Like, we are all very vulnerable. Our forests are very also important to protect. And I think people know that. So I think we are kind of moving fast in our region.
Okay, thank you very much. Gonzalo, and now we get to the business sector, and you're going to give us a take on what the business sector is thinking of in terms of its role in achieving that net zero objective that we all have, but also in how the business sector is engaging with political sector and civil society especially, and with what the Spanish Green Growth group is doing in this area as well.
Okay, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be at this panel. Really interesting thoughts. I would like to share with you three messages. The first is that apart from the climate crisis, we are experiencing an energy crisis, an economic crisis, biodiversity crisis, and social crisis. And the origin of all these crises is the same. It's an energy model based on fossil fuels. So that means that the solution to all these problems are the same. That is, to move from fossil fuels to an energy system based on renewables. This moving to the second point. So if we change our energy model, we are going to avoid the worst climate scenarios. It's going to be good for the climate crisis because it will reduce the energy prices. It will be good for the economy because it will create new and better jobs. It will be good for biodiversity. It will be good for energy security. So those are really important drivers for social support. So there are people concerned about climate crisis, but I can tell you that everyone is worried about the energy prices. Everyone is worried about their health, and fossil fuels are causing air pollution. So I think it's important to get social support to fight climate change, is to explain people that fighting, moving, changing the energy sector, we will have a lot of advantages. Regarding the private firms, like I work for Iberdrola, what we are seeing that there is an energy transition, but not fast enough. So society is demanding, especially youth, are demanding government, firms, and people to move faster. So we are seeing a technological revolution of clean solutions. Renewables are the cheapest way to produce electricity, but we have heat pumps, green hydrogen, and so on. And we are seeing an acceleration of climate and energy policies, not just for climate, but also for the energy security. So in this context, firms, we are accelerating our objectives of decarbonization. We are investing more and more in renewables. And we think, and in our case, it's very positive that this has to be good for people, I agree with you, and good for nature, biodiversity is another thing. But doing so is good for our shareholders because we open business opportunities, new business models, new technologies that are going to be the technologies of the future, but it's also good for society because it accelerates the solution to all these crises. So this is my view, and to do so, you're asking how we need policies. I agree, fair transition policies are key because all these solutions are competitive, but it's true, this is changing society and the economic system. It's really important. We need permitting and things like that, but we need to build alliances. That's very important. We need to build alliances with workers, with local communities. I think local communities, for instance in Brazil, if we want to do more renewables, or in Spain, we have to do it in a way that is good for local communities. And for that we need to have conversations with local communities to understand what they need, because we have to co-create solutions. And the other thing is that we need to build alliances with environmental NGOs and science to be sure that those objectives are supported by science but are also good for biodiversity and for nature. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gonzalo. Ambassador Kim, let me come back to you and ask you, in terms of this year's COP27 and what we see coming as results, concrete results that can help accelerate, that can help scale. From your perspective, what do you see there?
Very timely question, because tomorrow we are supposed to complete COP27. So at this time, actually, chief negotiators, they are negotiating about so-called cover decision, which is the outcome of this committee. There are diverse views, diverse proposals about key elements of a cover decision. However, all party members, we are very firm that this COP27 outcome must be Glasgow plus, because we produced very good, balanced, ambitious outcome at Glasgow last year, and this COP is for implementation COP. Therefore, Glasgow Climate Pact is something given to us. It's a starting point, and then at this COP we must agree how to accelerate the implementation and action, which is Glasgow plus. So far, regarding key elements about actions, such as like 1.5 degrees Celsius ambition, and also actions about coals and fossil fuel subsidies, and actions to accelerate NDC implementation, and raising the ambition of each NDCs to be aligned with 1.5 degree ambition. All those things we are currently discussing. Very positive signals are, first of all, the United States and China, they agreed at G20 summit in Bali to work together in climate action. Therefore, I strongly hope that Special Envoy Kerry and Special Envoy Xi Jianhua. I think the two gentlemen, they are talking very constructively at this time. And also in Bali, there was very important agreement made between G7 countries and Indonesia. Indonesia is one of the very highly dependent country on fossil fuels. However, just the energy transition partnership of Indonesia was finally agreed. Therefore, G7 member countries, they committed to provide $20 billion for Indonesia's energy transition. This is another remarkable partnership after Glasgow, because in Glasgow, G7, they agreed with South Africa to support their energy transition. And this year, they agreed with Indonesia to support their just energy transition. And as far as I know, the G7 countries and other developed countries, they are talking with other candidates, such as Vietnam, India, and Senegal as well. Therefore, more and more so-called emerging big developing economies, they are closer to the energy transition, and I believe these agreements will give a very positive influence to the negotiation about cover decision at this COP. And also particularly the Brazil is back, yes, and President Biden announced that America is back. Therefore, this kind of leadership of big players at global level indeed give a significantly positive signal to the negotiation. However, there are very different views and proposals regarding cover decision. Therefore, the progress is not, very frankly speaking, we have a long way to go. I must admit that we still have a long way to go, although tomorrow 6 p.m. is the deadline. Therefore, it means all parties must work harder, and then we indeed, all parties must support the Egyptian presidency, play a key leadership role in finalizing this cover decision, which must be ambitious and Glasgow plus.
Okay.
Very interesting.
Thank you. Very interesting. Yes. Prime Minister Campbell, you were also a member of the Overshoot Commission. And we were listening this morning to the Overshoot Commission, some of the Overshoot Commission members explaining and making a reference to the role that science plays, that facts play in all of the argumentation, let's say, and all of the development of the work that still needs to be done and the agreements that need to be reached. And can you give us a little bit of your views on that?
Well, it seems a pity that one is raising doubts about the science, given that the IPCC's work has been so deeply vetted and engages such a broad array of the world's most outstanding scientists. But that's an ongoing issue because there are people and some countries even that have interests in pushing back. So I think that when listening to all of the panelists, we really do need, as the premise of this panel was, leadership from all segments of society. When the ambassador talked about the commitments at G20 to support Indonesia and its energy transition, and last year to support South Africa, these are the kinds of things that only governments can do, that only governments have the resources and the ability to do this. But it will be the private sector that often will determine how it's done, that will create the innovations, that will find the mechanisms, and particularly in their local societies, based on local conditions, based on the actual needs and the potential. So often we miss the potential that a certain area has to make positive change because we're ignorant and we don't think to ask people. So we need leadership from all sides. But even where the science and the innovation is concerned, governments can play key roles. In the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, that the American Congress just passed, there are significant funds to support demonstration projects in certain kinds of technologies. Many years ago, when I was Prime Minister of Canada and running for election, I argued that Canada needed to commercialize its own innovation more, and that meant providing ways for people to create prototypes and the kinds of things that enable you to see whether something works. This recent policy in the US will provide a lot of that. So individual innovators, not just scientists, but inventors, people are working to find solutions to our problems, and the things that the Climate Overshoot Commission is looking at, technologies that could help us perhaps take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, capitalize on nature-based solutions to sequestering carbon, as well as some of the more esoteric geoengineering. All of these things, people are working, good brains are working, but unless the right leadership is exercised to connect the dots, to provide the resources that people need and to do the follow-up, it comes to nothing. So it's just another way of saying what I said from the beginning, that you can never have too much leadership, that people have to, but what leadership involves not just simply helping to establish a path for a particular group, but seeing the connections. And I do think that there's really amazing things coming from private sector companies that are looking for ways to meet their goals, and they have engineers and scientists of their own who are often very, very, very helpful. But then they often need the kinds of resources necessary to create the demonstration project to see if it really happens. So our Climate Overshoot Commission can say, what great news, there's somebody's developed a wonderful technology that's going to help us get back to our 1.5 goal. So that's a roundabout way of saying we need everybody in this fight.
Thank you very much. Ilona, let me ask you once again, because we've discussed this several times before, how you see the role both of youth and how youth leadership can best be brought. I mean, we've seen, and I've been in several COPs before, but not in the past years, and the change there is tremendous in the sense that we now have youth in certain delegations, we have youth in many of the different activities. How do you see youth leadership better coalescing and engaging?
Sure, thank you. This is, I think, very important, because whatever we're discussing here, we have to make sure it has to be future-proof. So it means it has to take into consideration the rights, the needs, and the livelihoods, well-being of children, of youth, but I mean the generations to come. And in general, because of the short-termism, we're not seeing that. So I think to have them in the room and at the table, and I'll explain how I see this, but to remind us that we need to be accountable for every single decision that is being made. And then again, like as also the ambassador brought here, in every sector, because if you don't have a climate, let's say a transversal climate authority looking at the impact of our industries, transportation, food systems, energy, of course environment, but every policy that is being designed in the long run, the impact on climate, on nature, and on well-being, they are not being taken into account. So the way I see is that actually the hope we have is that this new generation is coming with a lot of purpose, with a lot of strength, with a lot of commitment to make sure we keep committed. And I believe the change is intergenerational. I don't think the youth will deal because they don't have, let's say, the experience or the knowledge, or still like let's say, the resilience of the people that are more experienced, but without their enthusiasm, without their purpose, without their core values that are so, beautifully guarded today, I don't think we're gonna get the ambition we need to move forward. So definitely I welcome, and I think we need to learn how to listen to them more, to have honestly a seat, not only as a token, because many times we just include youth, but listen to them. It will open new perspectives, and it will help us to think out of the box and to be more ambitious. And so I I think it's not easy many times because sometimes they come with a language that is more abrupt, or sometimes they don't understand the incremental changes. They want it all now. But I think it's a good exchange, and I think everyone wins. And we can tell that in the experience that we've been sharing this last month, which has been very, very interesting.
No, and I heard this morning in one of the panels that in Brazil, those that, while the voting age is 18, those at 16 and between 16 and 18, there were 2 million signatures of youth between 16 and 18 that were spontaneously but in an organized manner came together.
Yeah, because it's a voluntary. In Brazil, voting is compulsory, but if you're 16 to 18, you can vote if you enlist. And there was an amazing enlisting of young people. So I think it made a difference because our election was very tight. So they came, and they came very linked to the climate cause. So it's a good, also, I think, a good lesson to democracy is listen to them and make sure. And if we want to live in democratic societies, as I think we do, at least I do, we need these voices. Just also, just thinking how can they exercise their agency, because it's very important.
Mm-hmm. And Camila, Chile has a very young government. Not young because it's just changed, but young also in age in terms of the composition. And it would be I'd be interesting to hear how you feel in a subject such as climate change, which is so connected in many ways to youth objectives, or the objectives of youth and the future, how you see or how the government sees itself bringing and addressing some of these issues, especially in the climate issues or gender issues or youth issues.
Yes. Well, so we have a new president that is the youngest president that we have had. And
how old?
36.
36.
Yes. And yes, there has been a lot of focus on climate change. He has been, for example, in our meetings with our intersectoral technical team that we meet every month, and he has go there to give the message that climate change, he wants to have the first ecological government. And he has related that very much with climate change. So he has asked us to work also with all sectors, not just in the Ministry of the Environment, but also very close to energy sector, and also mining, and also transport and agriculture. And for this, well, we have this law, and we have a carbon budget for the 2020-2030. And this budget, we have a national budget in our NDC, but we divided this in 7 ministries. So we have specific responsibilities for specific emissions in ministries, so it's easier to ask for actions, and they have to develop action plans. And we also have new instruments. We have carbon tax, and we also can now have caps for specific sources. We haven't implemented yet, but we have many instruments and opportunities to work with the different sectors and what works best with the different. And also in our in climate change instruments we are preparing, we consider a lot to ask population for their opinion. So we have very long consultations, like 3 months of consultation with people, with lots of workshops, so they can be informed of what we're talking about. Not only consider to have an opinion uninformed, but we try to make sure that they know what we are dealing with and where we want to move forward. So that is why also our instruments and policies have been sustainable in time. So they didn't change the policies we had in the last government for a new one, because a lot of population participated in this elaboration. So there's a consensus, and we also have a very focus on local work as well. So we have these sectorial plans, but we also in the climate change law, in the new one, all of the 6 regions, they have to make climate action plans, but also at the municipal level. We have 350 municipalities, and they all have to have climate action plans. And they all have to be interconnected within the local and the regional and the sector and national level.
Okay.
So we're like putting climate change everywhere we can. So that is the new mandate of this government.
Very good. Thank you. And Gonzalo, as a last question to you, what would you, as a representative of the private sector, what do you feel the private sector needs most? You've mentioned already framework and policies, but what do you think it needs most in terms of bringing these alliances to fruition, having these alliances succeed?
Okay, Marilena, when you made the presentation of the event, you mentioned, you said that there is a division sometimes in the public related when it comes to climate change. I don't know if you are thinking about the United States, but what I'm seeing is that there is a growing support of the population to climate change, and especially among youth. So, I think the interest of politicians and the interest of firms needs to be aligned with the interest of society. So, in terms of government, we have seen important changes in government in the last 4 years. So we have the case of Trump. I'm not talking, for instance, just about climate change. The gender equality, for instance. So the government or the politicians that don't answer to these concerns, climate change and gender, they may have difficulties in retaining government. So we have the case of the United States, we have the case of Brazil, we have the case in Chile, Australia is changing a lot. So I see that politicians are understanding a new social demand, and as a result,
We can't hear you.
yes, and as a result, the political and the international landscape is changing a lot. I agree that this is very positive. In relation to firms, it's the same. The interests of firms needs to be aligned with the interests of society if we want to be profitable in the future. And what we are seeing is that there is a growing concern among public people, and especially youth, about climate change, about gender equality, for instance. And for these reasons, we are putting objectives, top-down objectives, strategies. And I agree with you that once you know that business leaders understand the future and understand the needs of society, they put objectives, and we will attain these objectives. And as a result, in the energy sector, we are seeing a revolution of clean solutions. That is amazing. For instance, for hard-to-abate industries that only 2 or 3 years ago in Madrid COP was a big problem. And now, with green hydrogen, we are seeing that it's a solution, a competitive solution in 7 years. So the most important thing from this COP is a growing social support to fight climate change and to solve this energy crisis, social crisis, all at the same time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if there may be any questions from those of you that are here. If not, I don't know if any of you have anything more to say, but on my part, there's a question. Sorry, I didn't see you. Thank you, Jesse.
Yeah, gladly. This is a question that's on my mind as I was listening, desiring to see if the panelists could circle back around to the original framing at the introduction around the challenge between advancing climate action as constrained by democracy. I mean, of course, the example of the yellow vests in France are often given. I live in the Netherlands, where nitrogen pollution has been a big issue. Part of the motivation there for increased regulation. Closer. Okay, thank you. Closer. Is this better? There's a little feedback. In the Netherlands, where I live, increased regulations on nitrogen partially motivated by climate change concerns, largely motivated by just nitrogen pollution of waterways, have caused a grassroots protest from, particularly from farmers who are being asked, the country has to have less farms, the country has to have fewer farm animals. How can the leaders here, and we have politicians, we have political appointees, we have activists and NGO, civil society, how can action be advanced in this constrained context? Thank you.
Now, I don't know who you addressed the question to, but I am going to ask if there are any volunteers. If not, I'm going to ask Prime Minister Campbell to respond. Or Ambassador Kim.
Yes, very important question. I think in forging a consensus society level, so in forging a great consensus, the role of government is very important, because government, as Prime Minister Campbell already mentioned, the government has money, government has power to make a policy, government has many tools actually to support the people who are negative about climate action. So how to convince people to accept climate action as their key action for survival for the future. As in that sense, actually, government must invest a lot in raising awareness and educating people and convincing people, actually. And in that efforts, actually, the civil society leaders, I think, the academia and business sector as well, they can play a lot of role, to make people change their mind and change their behavior. However, I think there are certain people who believe that they will be negatively affected by strong climate action. Therefore, in that sense, government must provide sufficient so-called like social safety net for those people, and government must provide very tailored policy to support them to make a soft transition, because people really nobody wants to lose their job, nobody wants to be negatively or economically negatively affected. Therefore, government must provide support in many forms, and in that sense, government must be innovative as well. And in that sense, I think actually many developing countries, because they don't have enough money, enough technology, enough capacity to make such soft social transition, that's why developed countries must provide the support to developing countries, not only in technology or finance, but also in policy advisory services, in capacity development as well.
Could
Thank
I
you.
just
Prime
add
Minister.
that, because the question comes from a situation in the Netherlands, which is a developed country, I think it's foolish for us to assume or to say or to give the impression that we can make the energy transition, that we can move away from fossil fuels and deal with our pollution issues without any kind of pain or anguish or disruption of life for people. Of course there will be. And that is why, again, our collective sharing of ideas and experiences is so important. Because very often you read, I mean, for cattle raisers, for example, it's not just that they have lived their lives this way and earned their living this way, but they feel a fondness for the animals, they feel a kind of link to them, it's part of their whole culture. And when you say to them, what you're doing is ecologically disruptive, that's a terrible thing, and no one wants to believe that. So if we can share the experiences of people in other parts of the world who have either altered how they conduct this, perhaps raising fewer animals, changing feed, there's a whole lot of things that people do, or ways in which they have found to transition their farms into different forms of production, where one farmer who has done it is telling another of his or her own experience, not somebody from the government coming and saying you must do this. So governments set the goals of where we have to go. But it's not just, again, to be nice to people. It is to respect the reality of people's lives. And I think that's something that when politicians go out and talk to people, they begin to get those messages, but also respecting the ability of people who are going through these experiences in other places to share their knowledge and to be part of the solution and to create that sense of camaraderie and a kind of an industry mentality and solidarity that's in a good way. And that's why these kinds of meetings and the global connection is really important, as countries can say, you know, where are the best practices? You know, they might be in a place in Africa, they might be in a place in South America, but what have we learned? And are those lessons translatable to this particular situation, for example, in the Netherlands? It's not magic, and I'm not saying that you can never dispel all of the disappointment, frustration, and dislocation people feel, but you can approach it in a humane way and understand that we're asking people to change their lives because we think that their lives will get better and that the lives of their children and grandchildren will be better. And I often say, when people say to me, "What are you doing now?" I say, "I'm working on being a good ancestor." And I think if we all think about how can we be good ancestors, that may mean, you know, my father was a good ancestor when he went to war in World War II, because he made a peaceful world, helped to make a peaceful world for me to live in. And so what can we do to be good ancestors for our children and grandchildren? And that may mean a little bit of pain, but the satisfaction we get from knowing that the cathedral is going to be built will be very good.
Well, thank you all very, very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for having this wonderful discussion and for enriching us and for together showing us the way. Thank you.
Thank you for all the people who are here at COP with you.